December 26, 1944, 8 a.m., Bastogne, Belgium. Major General Anthony McAuliffe stood in a frozen basement that served as the 101st Airborne Division headquarters and read the German surrender demand for the second time. 4 panzer divisions surrounded his position. His forces were outnumbered 3-1. Ammunition was critically low. Medical supplies were exhausted. The weather prevented air resupply. German officers, confident that the American troops would recognize the tactical impossibility of continued resistance, awaited a reasonable response to their ultimatum. McAuliffe wrote a single word on the paper and handed it to his operations officer: "Nuts." The response, delivered to confused German commanders, summarized an approach to warfare that characterized American generals throughout World War II: an absolute refusal to accept defeat, combined with tactical aggression that inflicted casualties at rates that enemy forces couldn't sustain. The American generals who commanded forces in World War II killed approximately 1.5 million Axis soldiers through combat operations between 1942 and 1945. The distribution wasn't equal. 5 generals, through a combination of tactical competence, operational scale, and sustained combat operations, accounted for a disproportionate share of those casualties. These weren't necessarily the most famous generals, though some achieved fame. They weren't necessarily the most strategically important, though all contributed to Allied victory. They were, measured by the number of enemy killed in action under their command, the most lethal American combat commanders of the war. The ranking begins with understanding that lethality isn't heroism. Killing enemy soldiers was necessary work executed by professional military officers following orders from civilian leadership. The moral questions about strategic bombing, the ethics of total war, and the human cost of conflict existed then as now, but measured purely by the metric that military establishments use to assess combat effectiveness: enemy casualties inflicted. 5 American generals stand above their peers. Number 5. Lieutenant General Lucien Truscott. May 23, 1944. Anzio beachhead, Italy. Truscott, commanding 6th Corps, received orders to break out from the beachhead that had contained Allied forces for 4 months. The German 14th Army, entrenched in defensive positions across the Alban Hills, had repelled every previous breakout attempt. Truscott's plan ignored the obvious approach toward Rome and instead directed his corps northwest toward Valmontone, intending to cut Highway 6 and trap the German 10th Army retreating from Cassino. The tactical concept was sound. The execution would kill approximately 23,000 German soldiers over the next month as 6th Corps shattered German defensive lines through sustained offensive operations that German commanders couldn't contain. Truscott, born in 1995 in Texas, commissioned as a cavalry officer in 1917, exemplified professional competence rather than charismatic brilliance. He didn't seek publicity. He didn't cultivate relationships with journalists. He commanded through technical mastery of combined arms operations and relentless attention to logistics that enabled sustained offensive operations when other commanders were consolidating gains. His forces killed Germans through methodical, continuous pressure that didn't allow enemy units time to reorganize or establish new defensive positions. The Italian campaign, June 1944 through May 1945, became Truscott's killing ground. After breaking out from Anzio, his forces pursued German armies north through Italy, fighting through defensive lines at Trasimene, the Gothic Line, and the Po Valley. German forces, defending mountainous terrain that favored defense, suffered approximately 48,000 killed in action against Truscott's 6th Corps and later 5th Army when Truscott assumed command in December 1944. The casualty rate reflected operational doctrine that emphasized firepower over maneuver, using artillery and air support to destroy German positions before the infantry advanced. The numbers were systematic rather than spectacular. Truscott's forces didn't achieve breakthrough victories like Patton's advances across France. They ground through prepared German defensive positions using overwhelming firepower that killed defenders who couldn't retreat because Hitler's strategic direction forbade withdrawal. The Italian campaign is often dismissed as a secondary theater, but the approximately 65,000 German soldiers killed in action against American forces in Italy between June 1944 and May 1945 represented casualties that couldn't reinforce the eastern or western fronts during the war's decisive campaigns. Truscott's lethality derived from competence rather than innovation. He used available resources, artillery, air support, and infantry coordination better than most commanders, resulting in combat operations that consistently achieved objectives with acceptable American casualties while inflicting disproportionate enemy losses. His casualty exchange ratio, approximately 1 to 3.5 American to German killed in action, reflected superior training, firepower, and logistics rather than tactical genius. The work was brutal, attritional, and effective. Number 4. General Curtis LeMay. March 9, 1945, 11:45 p.m., 5,000 feet above Tokyo. The first Boeing B-29 Superfortress dropped incendiary bombs on residential areas in the Asakasa district. Within minutes, fires spread through wooden structures, creating firestorms that killed approximately 100,000 civilians in a single night. LeMay, commanding 21st Bomber Command, had ordered the mission despite knowing that bombing residential areas would produce mass civilian casualties. The strategic justification that Japanese cottage industries dispersed throughout residential areas contributed to war production was technically accurate, but morally thin. The tactical result was that a single night of firebombing killed more Japanese than the atomic bomb would kill at Hiroshima 4 months later. LeMay, born in 1906 in Ohio, commissioned through ROTC in 1928, represented a different type of lethality than ground commanders. He killed through strategic bombing that targeted industrial capacity, transportation infrastructure, and, increasingly as the war continued, civilian populations. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan, which LeMay directed from January 1945 through August 1945, killed approximately 330,000 Japanese through conventional bombing and another 200,000 through atomic weapons. The numbers were staggering. 67 Japanese cities were substantially destroyed through firebombing operations that LeMay planned and executed. The missions flew at night, at low altitude, using incendiary bombs specifically designed to ignite fires in wooden Japanese urban construction. German cities, bombed by the British and Americans from 1943 to 1945, were stone and concrete. Japanese cities were wood and paper. The difference in casualty rates reflected architectural vulnerability as much as bombing tonnage. LeMay's defenders argue that strategic bombing shortened the war, saving Allied lives by destroying Japanese industrial capacity and civilian morale. His critics note that by 1945, American submarines had already strangled Japanese industrial production through merchant shipping interdiction, that Japanese cities had minimal military value, and that firebombing residential areas violated international law regarding distinction between military and civilian targets. Both assessments are accurate. LeMay killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese, primarily civilians, through operations of questionable legal and moral standing. The operations contributed to the Japanese surrender, though how much remains debated. The atomic bombs, delivered by aircraft under LeMay's operational control, killed approximately 200,000 Japanese immediately, with additional deaths from radiation exposure reaching possibly 340,000 by 1950. LeMay's direct responsibility for these deaths is complicated by the fact that the atomic bomb missions were directed by Theater Command rather than 21st Bomber Command, but operationally, the aircraft, crews, and mission execution all fell under LeMay's authority. The total number of Japanese killed through strategic bombing operations commanded by LeMay approaches 500,000, making him the single most lethal American commander measured by enemy deaths. The moral complexity prevents a simple assessment. LeMay killed more enemy combatants and non-combatants than any other American general. He did so following orders from civilian leadership that had determined strategic bombing was necessary to force the Japanese surrender without invasion. The operations worked in the sense that Japan surrendered without the projected invasion that would have killed millions. Whether the same outcome could have been achieved with fewer civilian deaths remains unknowable. Number 3. Lieutenant General George S. Patton. August 1, 1944. Avranches, France. Patton, commanding 3rd Army, drove his staff car through streets clogged with military vehicles and infantry advancing south from the Normandy beachhead. The 3rd Army had become operational 24 hours earlier. Patton's orders were to exploit the breakthrough at Saint-Lô by advancing rapidly through Brittany and securing ports. Patton ignored the orders. He sent minimum forces toward Brittany and directed his main effort east toward Paris and beyond, initiating a pursuit operation that would continue for 3 months and kill approximately 145,000 German soldiers as the Third Army advanced across France and into Germany. Patton, born in 1885 in California, commissioned through West Point in 1909, was already famous by August 1944. His command of the 7th Army in Sicily, his relief after the slapping incidents, and his subsequent command of the fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group as part of Overlord deception operations had made him the most recognized American general after Eisenhower. But recognition didn't correlate with lethality. Patton's operational skill, his understanding of mobile warfare, and his willingness to sustain offensive operations despite logistics constraints produced casualty rates that exceeded those of any other American ground commander. The pursuit across France, August-September 1944, killed Germans at rates exceeding 1,500 per day. Patton's armored divisions, advancing faster than German forces could retreat, encircled and destroyed multiple German divisions. The Falaise Pocket, while primarily a British and Canadian operation, included Third Army forces that trapped approximately 50,000 Germans, of whom 10,000 were killed. The subsequent advance through Lorraine, the Battle of the Bulge, the drive into Germany, and the relief of Czechoslovakia collectively killed approximately 180,000 German soldiers under Patton's command. The numbers reflected operational tempo rather than set-piece battles. Patton didn't fight midways or Stalingrads. He conducted mobile operations where German forces attempting to establish defensive lines were overrun before positions could be fortified. The casualties resulted from pursuing retreating forces, destroying isolated German units, and maintaining pressure that prevented German armies from organizing effective resistance. The doctrine was exhausting for American forces and catastrophic for German defenders. Patton's lethality derived from relentlessness. He advanced when other commanders consolidated. He attacked when logistics suggested defense. He maintained offensive operations through conditions that conventional doctrine considered unsuitable for major combat operations. The approach worked because American industrial capacity could sustain the ammunition and fuel expenditure that Patton's operational tempo required. German forces, lacking equivalent logistical depth, couldn't match the sustained operational pressure. The controversy surrounding Patton, the slapping incidents, the political statements, the personal conduct, is well documented, but measured strictly by the mission that ground combat commanders execute, closing with and destroying enemy forces, Patton was extraordinarily effective. Third Army, under his command, killed more Germans per day of combat operations than any other American army in Europe. The exchange ratio, approximately 1 to 2.7 Americans to Germans killed, reflected aggressive tactics that prioritized speed over casualties, but never approached the human wave tactics that produced catastrophic losses in other theaters. Number 2. General Omar Bradley. September 12, 1944. SHAEF Headquarters, Versailles, France. Bradley, commanding 12th Army Group, reviewed casualty reports from the breakout from Normandy and the subsequent pursuit across France. American forces under his command, 1st Army, 3rd Army, 9th Army, and 15th Army, had killed approximately 135,000 Germans in 6 weeks of mobile warfare. The numbers would continue climbing as the 12th Army Group advanced into Germany, fought through the Siegfried Line, defended against the Ardennes offensive, crossed the Rhine, and pursued German forces into central Germany. By war's end, forces under Bradley's command would kill approximately 350,000 German soldiers, making him the most lethal American ground force commander of the war. Bradley, born 1893 in Missouri, commissioned through West Point in 1915, represented professional competence elevated to Army Group command. He wasn't flamboyant like Patton. He wasn't politically connected like Macarthur. He was a methodical, competent officer who commanded the largest American field formation in history and oversaw operations that systematically destroyed German military capacity in Western Europe. The lethality wasn't personal, it was institutional. Bradley commanded forces that collectively killed more Germans than any other Allied formation except Soviet army groups. The numbers were staggering. 12th Army Group, at peak strength in March 1945, consisted of 4 field armies comprising 48 divisions with approximately 1.3 million soldiers. This formation conducted combat operations from August 1944 through May 1945, engaging German forces across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, and Czechoslovakia. The sustained combat operations, supported by overwhelming air superiority and logistical capacity that German forces couldn't match, killed Germans at rates approaching 1,200 per day, averaged across 9 months of operations. Bradley's command style emphasized methodical planning, coordination between subordinate armies, and allocation of resources based on operational priorities. He wasn't a tactical innovator. He executed conventional operations using doctrinal methods that American forces had refined through training and combat experience. The lethality is derived from scale and sustainment rather than tactical brilliance. 12th Army Group operations killed Germans through the systematic application of firepower that German defensive operations couldn't counter. The Battle of the Bulge, December 1944, January 1945, demonstrated Bradley's approach under crisis. German offensive operations created a salient that threatened to split Allied forces and recapture Antwerp. Bradley, maintaining operational control despite Eisenhower temporarily reassigning Northern forces to Montgomery, coordinated counterattacks that contained the penetration and destroyed German armored reserves. The battle killed approximately 19,000 Americans and 100,000 Germans, a casualty exchange ratio of 1 to 5.3 that reflected the firepower advantages that German forces couldn't overcome despite tactical and operational surprise. The Rhine crossing, March 1945, and subsequent advance into Germany killed Germans at accelerating rates as German defensive capacity collapsed. 12th Army Group forces advancing across Germany on multiple axes captured or killed entire German armies that Hitler's orders prevented from surrendering until their strategic position became hopeless. The final month of operations, April-May 1945, killed approximately 45,000 Germans as organized resistance disintegrated. Bradley's lethality was organizational rather than personal. He commanded vast forces operating across broad fronts, coordinating logistics and operations at scales unprecedented in American military history. The casualties resulted from system effectiveness, training, equipment, air superiority, logistics, rather than individual tactical genius. But the ultimate responsibility for operations that killed 350,000 Germans rested with the commander of 12th Army Group. By that measure, Bradley was the most lethal American ground force commander of the war. Number 1. General Douglas MacArthur. October 20, 1944, Leyte Beach, Philippines. MacArthur waded ashore from a landing craft in a staged photograph that would define his public image for decades. Behind the theatrical return, MacArthur commanded the Southwest Pacific area, directing operations across New Guinea, the Philippines, and eventually the invasion of Japan. The forces under his command had been killing Japanese soldiers since August 1942, first in Papua New Guinea, then through island-hopping operations that bypassed fortified positions, and finally in the reconquest of the Philippines. By war's end, MacArthur's forces would kill approximately 550,000 Japanese soldiers, making him the most lethal American theater commander of the war. MacArthur, born in 1880 in Arkansas, commissioned through West Point in 1903, was the most politically astute American general. His command of the Southwest Pacific area reflected this political skill. He had maneuvered to receive independent theater command rather than serving under a unified Pacific command that would have subordinated him to Navy leadership. The command arrangement was inefficient, duplicating logistics and operations that unified command could have streamlined. But it gave MacArthur operational freedom to conduct campaigns according to his preferred doctrine: bypass fortified positions, focus on objectives that advanced toward Japan, and minimize American casualties even if it meant extended operations. The casualty numbers reflected operational choices. MacArthur's forces, advancing through New Guinea and the Philippines, encountered approximately 750,000 Japanese soldiers distributed across garrisons that Imperial General Headquarters couldn't reinforce or evacuate. Japanese doctrine forbade surrender. American doctrine emphasized firepower over maneuver. The combination produced casualty rates exceeding 85% for Japanese garrisons that American forces engaged. Bypassed garrisons, isolated by American advances and unable to sustain themselves, suffered additional casualties from starvation and disease that approached 75% of garrison strength. The lethality was systematic. MacArthur's campaigns in New Guinea, 1942 to 1944, killed approximately 200,000 Japanese through combat operations and interdiction that prevented resupply. The Philippines campaign, October 1944 to August 1945, killed approximately 350,000 Japanese through sustained combat operations across Luzon, the Visayas, and Mindanao. The operations emphasized attrition rather than maneuver, using firepower advantages to destroy Japanese defensive positions while minimizing American casualties. The strategic debate continues about whether MacArthur's campaigns contributed to Japanese defeat or merely killed Japanese soldiers, while the submarine blockade and strategic bombing accomplished the decisive work of destroying Japanese war-making capacity. The debate is ultimately unresolvable because strategy operates at multiple levels simultaneously. Submarines strangled Japanese industry. Strategic bombing destroyed Japanese cities. Macarthur's campaigns killed Japanese armies and recaptured territory. All contributed to forcing the Japanese surrender. The casualties Macarthur's forces inflicted represented approximately one-third of Japanese military deaths during the war. The remaining two-thirds died in China, Burma, Pacific Island campaigns under Navy command, and through strategic bombing. But measured purely by enemy soldiers killed under a single American commander's authority, Macarthur exceeded all others. The approximately 550,000 Japanese killed through Southwest Pacific Area operations between 1942 and 1945 represented lethality at scales unprecedented in American military history. The moral complexity parallels LeMay's strategic bombing. Macarthur killed Japanese soldiers who, following their military's doctrine, rarely surrendered and often fought to the death. American forces offered minimal opportunity to accept Japanese surrender, killed Japanese soldiers through firepower that emphasized American survivability over enemy casualties. The operations were brutal. They were also effective. Macarthur recaptured the Philippines, secured jumping-off positions for the planned invasion of Japan, and killed over 500,000 Japanese in the process. The five generals, Truscott, LeMay, Patton, Bradley, and Macarthur, collectively commanded operations that killed approximately 1.5 million Axis soldiers during the war. The number represents approximately 15% of total Axis military deaths during the war. The remaining 85% died in operations commanded by other American generals, British and Commonwealth forces, and overwhelmingly by Soviet forces, whose Eastern Front operations killed approximately 4 million German soldiers. The lethality rankings don't correlate with heroism, strategic importance, or historical reputation. They measure a specific metric, enemy killed under command, that military establishments use to assess combat effectiveness, but that civilian populations rightfully view with moral complexity. The generals who killed most effectively weren't necessarily the best. They commanded the largest forces, fought in theaters where engagement rules favored lethality, and operated under strategic direction that emphasized enemy destruction over other military objectives. The death ray never worked because physics wouldn't allow it. The Bailey Bridge worked because simplicity enabled deployment. The Dauntless worked because the design matched the mission. And American generals killed Axis soldiers at rates unprecedented in American military history because industrial capacity, training systems, and strategic direction created military forces capable of sustaining operations that systematically destroyed enemy armies. The generals who commanded those forces executed missions that civilian leadership had determined necessary for Allied victory. The casualties they inflicted were the arithmetic of total war. 79 years later, the rankings remain controversial. Should strategic bombing casualties count equally to ground combat casualties? Should commanders of larger forces receive credit for organizational lethality that subordinate commanders executed? Should the Japanese garrisons who died from starvation and disease count as casualties inflicted by the commander whose operations isolated them? The questions have no definitive answers because lethality measurement, while mathematically straightforward, carries moral complexity that defies simple assessment. What's undeniable is that 5 American generals commanded operations that killed over 1.5 million Axis soldiers through campaigns that spanned 3 years and 3 continents. The work wasn't clean, it wasn't heroic, it was the brutal arithmetic of industrial warfare, executed by professional military officers following strategic direction from civilian leadership. And measured by the metric that military establishments use to assess combat commanders, enemy casualties inflicted, these 5 generals stand above their peers as the most lethal American commanders of World War II. The German officers who received McAuliffe's response at Bastogne couldn't comprehend the refusal to accept military logic that dictated surrender. American forces, surrounded and outgunned, should recognize the tactical reality and surrender with honor intact. McAuliffe's response and the subsequent defense of Bastogne that killed approximately 12,000 Germans illustrated a broader pattern. American generals, commanding forces with material advantages that the Axis powers couldn't match, fought with aggression that prioritized enemy destruction over operational caution. The lethality that resulted wasn't an accident, it was doctrine, executed by commanders who understood that industrial warfare rewarded sustained offensive operations that killed enemy soldiers faster than replacement systems could sustain. And by that measure, these 5 generals were the most effective killers the American military produced during the deadliest war in human history.